chair. This session is on context of security sector governance in Africa, and there are three presenters. First is Dylan Hendrickson, and he will be speaking to how have donor conceptions of security sector reform evolved in response to the changing context in Africa. Second is by Maxi Schoeman, and it's South Africa's role in African Union security sector engagement on the continent, i.e. in Africa. And third is by Shadrack Nasong'o, and it's on terrorism, security, and society, implications of society-level transformation in East Africa. Okay, I stand corrected. So let me look at it now. Where is it? Page 14. I stand corrected by Professor Nasong'o. The correct title of his presentation is The Challenge of Terrorism in East Africa, Rethinking National Security Conceptualization and Practice. So, who goes first? Who volunteers to go first? Very good. So we shall go in the order of the program with Dylan Hendrickson. I am very generous. I give you 15 minutes.
15?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today as as an honorary African. It's also been very interesting the past few days to listen to the discussions. I must admit that my own thinking has developed quite a bit in the last 2 days, and to a certain extent my talk as well has changed and has evolved simply because of some of the ideas put forth, partly because a lot of the issues which I wanted to raise have come up in some of the talks, and also because I thought that there were a few specific areas where I could perhaps add value with my particular talk, and also the chapter which I'm in the process of writing. So my focus really is on the question of evolving donor conceptions of security sector reform. And the focus of my chapter is going to be on how the donor SSR policy agenda has evolved in recent years in response to the changing political and security dynamics in Africa. I think it's important to start by saying that the SSR concept and policy agenda emerged in the UK in the late 1990s, but the development of SSR was heavily influenced by a parallel process of rethinking security concepts, which was underway in Africa and Eastern Europe at the time. And so Africans have played and continue to play key roles in shaping SSR thinking. And I don't need to state the obvious that many of the key thinkers that have been involved in this process are in this room, including, of course, our dear Dr. Funmi Olonisakin, who has made a very big impact in this particular area. So when we talk about the SSR agenda, I think it's very important as well to distinguish between SSR thinking, broadly defined, which has evolved significantly in recent years, and which has involved many different actors across the world, and to distinguish that from donor SSR practice. So there's SSR thinking on the one hand, which we have collectively contributed to, and there's donor SSR practice, which is much narrower and which reflects in the sense how they have interpreted that thinking and sought to implement SSR in their assistance programs. And the basic argument that I want to develop in my chapter, which is still very much work in progress, is that there's been a significant lag between the evolution of SSR thinking, which many of us have been involved in, and the development of donor SSR policy. And what I want to do in my chapter is explore the reasons why there has been this lag. In the decade that followed the emergence of SSR, it very quickly became the dominant framework through which international actors, particularly on the development side, have assessed the problems of security and justice provision in Africa and have gone about seeking to deliver assistance to remedy these problems. And SSR's rapid ascendance on the donor agenda reflects a number of interrelated factors, including the proliferation of armed conflicts at the end of the Cold War, a growing belief among development actors that were involved in post-conflict reconstruction that they had a very specific role to play in supporting security-related reforms, which before then had been out of limits for them. And then finally, a recognition that past train and equip approaches to security assistance on the international side had in most cases failed to actually enhance security sector governance and deliver improved security for citizens, in large part because they weren't intended to do that in the first place. They were about supporting regimes, particularly during the Cold War. So the SSR approach represented a very radical departure from these more traditional approaches to security assistance in, I think, three important ways. First, SSR was based on a more holistic, people-centered concept of security. It placed emphasis on the need for governance orientation in security reforms, and it advocated a sector-wide approach to reform, bringing in a range of security and civilian actors, all in a bid to have a comprehensive approach to dealing with security sector issues. Even more importantly, I think SSR held open the promise of a genuinely developmental approach to addressing security problems. And it did this in two ways, I think. First of all, by affirming the need for countries that are receiving SSR assistance to define their own priorities rather than being held hostage to the agendas of external actors, as was the case during the Cold War. And secondly, by rethinking how SSR assistance can be delivered so that it is tailored to the local context, much more supportive of nationally led reform processes, and also so that it promotes inclusion by national actors in the design and implementation of donor SSR assistance programs. Having said that, despite these seemingly progressive features, SSR was met with a mixed reception by many African countries, and particularly their governments. And under pressure from both domestic reformers in these African countries as well as external actors, a growing number of African countries did actually embrace the language of SSR. In practice, however, as we know, many fewer countries have actively sought to integrate SSR principles and policy prescriptions into their own security reform programs. And I think this mixed reception to SSR reflected the sensitivity of the security sector for many African governments, as well as real suspicions about the motives of donors for intervening in this sector. And again, it's important to note that for development donors, this was really a very new thing. But I think there were also more fundamental concerns in African countries that SSR was not adequately tailored to African realities. And these concerns have come to the fore in recent years in the face of dramatic changes in Africa's political and security environment, which are, of course, the focus of this particular workshop. There are two dimensions to these changes and the challenges that they pose for SSR and donor assistance, which I want to highlight. And I think the first is very much the internal dimension in Africa, which relates to the limitations of the state in meeting the security needs of its population in the face of elitist agendas, new security threats, and increasingly marginalized populations. And this has been discussed quite a bit already this morning, and so I won't say much more about that. However, what I would add is that SSR is a state-centric agenda, and these changes have exposed some of the obvious limitations of SSR. The second dimension relates to the external environment and the impact of donor countries' national interests on their aid programs. It's important to keep in mind that SSR was only in its infancy when the 9/11 attacks occurred in New York and the US-led war on terror was launched. And this so-called war has had many different consequences for donor aid programs, including the diversion of aid away from Africa and the heightened attention placed on security as a key foreign policy objective of donor countries. And the emphasis on counterterrorism has placed the SSR agenda under considerable pressure. In particular, there's been huge pressure by certain donor countries on African governments to shape their security services to meet the needs of Western countries rather than the needs of their own people. In many cases, donors have elevated operational effectiveness of security services, and in particular intelligence services and police forces, above the development of democratic accountability and oversight mechanisms. And so I think it's fair to say that the SSR agenda has never actually fully recovered from the hit which it took about 15 years ago from the war on terror. That is not to say, however, that SSR programs have come to a halt. On the contrary, there's been a real resurgence of SSR assistance programs in many countries, particularly those emerging from conflict. And as we know now, virtually every donor that is engaged in conflict-affected countries is engaged in one way or another in so-called SSR programs, whatever that means in the particular context. What's interesting, though, is I think what we've seen in many of these cases is that SSR assistance is being given side by side with more traditional forms of security assistance, which can actually undermine SSR objectives. And at the very least, when donors give two different kinds of assistance in the same space, this sends very mixed messages to government about what donor priorities are for reform and what they consider to be important. Is it effectiveness of security forces, or is it accountability? Is it responsiveness to the needs of people, or is it responsiveness to the needs of elites and the regimes that are in power? And as we all know, African governments themselves, particularly those who have not been keen on SSR, have also been very adept at accepting this aid, while at the same time stalling an undertaking when it comes to undertaking serious governance reforms. And donors, for their part, have actually been quite cautious about demanding politically difficult reforms. So this game goes on where we provide SSR assistance, and the government plays lip service to all the aims of these programs, but in practice there's often very, very little progress. That's not to say that nothing's achieved. Capacity is often improved, policy debates take place. So it's always a question of 2 steps forward and sometimes a step back. But there are major limitations to these SSR programs. Anyway, what I wanted to get is to get back to this question of the lag between SSR thinking and donor policy and practice. And I think there are several very important reasons for this lag which we need to understand, which relate very much to the themes of this workshop. The first of these reasons relates to the very weak empirical basis of the SSR agenda. Not as it stands today per se, but when it was established 15 years ago. Even as donor issues, even as security issues moved up the development donor agenda in the 1990s, there was generally a very low priority accorded to empirical research on security issues for 3 reasons. First, because of the pressure placed on donor aid agencies to act or to be seen to be acting before there was actually an adequate understanding of the context. There was pressure to respond very quickly in post-conflict countries. Sierra Leone is a very good example of that, because that's where the first SSR program was launched by DFID. A second reason is because of the general lack of expertise on security issues within development agencies, which actually led to very unrealistic expectations about what could be achieved. There were many people involved in these programs who actually did not have a background in security. Many of them came from a governance background or other kinds of backgrounds. And third, because of the origins of the SSR agenda itself, which was actually heavily influenced by good governance thinking, a managerial approach to reform, and also which was a very normative agenda. And I think this combination of factors favored approaches to donor assistance that were in the early days very prescriptive, very technical, and very managerial in nature. And this in turn has left many SSR practitioners on the donor side, but more generally, very ill-equipped to understand, much less to engage with, the politics of reform processes. In the early days of SSR, and this was 99, 2000, at the very time that CSDG, which Funmi and I and Charles have been part of for many years, the very time that CSDG was established, and we were established by DFID to help them develop their SSR agenda. But in the early days of SSR, much of the donor commission research that was conducted on SSR, and this includes the research which we did, was actually policy-driven, very narrowly policy-driven, reflecting the imperative to develop and administer SSR programs. An insufficient effort was made to draw on existing research of relevance to SSR, including academic studies on military, policing, and justice issues that were produced in developing countries, including Africa. So that's not to say that this information did not exist. It's just to say that we were not necessarily encouraged to draw upon that information, and that donors were looking for much quicker, shorter-term research that was not necessarily empirical or rigorous in nature. But as a consequence, much of the early SSR policy research was misleadingly optimistic about the prospect for change in African security sectors along the lines which are mapped out. And Professor Evovled, who we all know, has noted that the civil-military relations literature of the 1970s and 1980s was much more cynical and pessimistic about prospects for achieving meaningful reform, largely because it focused in great detail on power relations. And so there's a recognition that, reform is bloody difficult. This academic literature, however, was largely overlooked by the donor architects of security sector reform because they did not come in easily digestible packets which aid bureaucracies could use, and also because it raised very difficult issues which might actually call into question the basic SSR approach that was being developed by donors. Keep in mind that donors needed to be seen to be acting very, very quickly. And so the donor SSR approach which emerged was heavily influenced by a normative framework and a standard set of assumptions about how reforming countries should organize and operate their security sectors. And there was strong emphasis on norms such as democratization, civilian control of the military, and a strong civil society role. This emphasis detracted from good analysis of how African security institutions actually function, and more to the point, missed out on the fact that many African countries were actually carrying out reforms in the security sector. They weren't necessarily SSR per se, but they were carrying out reforms, and it was very important to understand what these reforms were, what they were doing, and why they were or were not achieving their objectives. And so accordingly, there was a tendency to think of the state as a primary security actor and to assume that civilian policy sectors have much more of an influence over security policy making than they actually do, or is possible given the prevailing culture in many countries. However, to a large extent, this has changed in recent years. There's been a greater convergence between the donor, policy-driven strand of SSR research and academic strands of research on security issues. And indeed, following the early implementation difficulties faced by DFID and other donors in some of the SSR countries where they were working, the UK government started to come to terms with the need for a stronger evidence base for the SSR agenda. And this resulted in a flurry of actually quite good empirical research and a willingness of donors, in particular the UK government, to pay greater attention to research emerging from Africa and other regions where SSR assistance is provided. And this shift also coincided with the development of the GFN SSR, the Global Facilitation Network, who some of you may know, but also the African Security Sector Network, which Boubacar is currently chair of. And both of these institutions have generated substantive, good quality empirical research in SSR. And the truth of the matter is this research has gone a long way in shaping current donor SSR thinking and has fed into the UK government's SSR development processes and also those of other donors. So by way of conclusion, the key question, of course, is to what extent have donor SSR agendas actually evolved then in recent years in response to this new research and in response to the change in security environment in regions such as Africa? You'll have to read my chapter to get a conclusive answer to that, but just a few sort of quick points on this. I mean, the first point I'd make is that there has actually been, in my view, a very significant evolution in thinking at the policy level among donors to take into account the reality of non-state security and justice provision, to engage with the reality of informal institutional processes in security sectors, and to confront the fact that in some of the countries where donors are working, governments simply do not subscribe to SSR principles or objectives. This is meant acknowledging that SSR is an inherently political process. And while donors are still grappling with the best way to address this, most donors have, in my view, come to terms with that reality. And that's a very big step forward from certainly many of the debates that I was involved in 15 years ago. For the most part, however, the donor SSR agenda remains a very state-centric one. And this is, in my view, is unlikely to change because many of the reforms implied by SSR require some form of political authority to implement. In addition, donors can generally do very little without the approval of the powers that be in countries. And that usually means working through them or with them, even where they are considered part of the problem and where the solutions are thought to be outside the security sector. There's been a very interesting conceptual development relating to security sector stabilization, which has been emerging within the UK. And this seeks to address a reality facing a number of countries, and Central African Republic might be one of these, and Somalia may be another, which is that security, effectively, the restoration of security cannot wait for security sector reform. Security sector reform is a long-term agenda. And so the key question is, what can external actors do? And because the political institutional conditions for security sector reform are not in place, effectively a two-speed approach is required, which seeks to stabilize the security situation on the one hand, working through local actors, while creating the conditions for longer-term security sector reform. So security sector stabilization is actually quite an innovative concept, which has been influenced by UK experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, but is increasingly being tailored to other situations, I think, including in Africa. And in my view, its potential lies in the fact that it recognizes the primacy of the political process in resolving security problems and the need to engage both state and non-state security actors. So by way of conclusion, my view is that SSR thinking, and that includes thinking among many donors, certainly the more progressive ones, has come a very long way in recent years. And this is in large part due to good empirical research and analysis, which is now feeding into policy processes. So my key concern as somebody working on SSR and working with donors is not the concept per se. It's not perfect, but it's certainly shown the ability to evolve and to adapt in recent years. My bigger concern, of course, is donors' ability to implement SSR in line with the principles which underpin this agenda. And I think the key problem is that very few donors have adequately invested in developing capacity in this area. SSR actually requires donors to work in very, very different ways than they did in the past when they provided security assistance in the traditional way, focusing on train and equip. Many donors have simply renamed existing security-related activities as SSR, with considering what is distinctive about this agenda at both a policy and a programming level. And many of you will remember the early days in Liberia when the Americans went around with baseball caps that said SSR on it. And these are all private security actors, all ex-military, retired, who probably had no idea of what SSR was about. But I think while the SSR, I think the problem is that many of the donors are conducting SSR with actually thinking about what is distinctive about this agenda. And so while the SSR term has actually gained currency in recent years, one can also question whether it has not simultaneously lost a significant portion of its meaning. And I think that's really the key challenge which we need to engage with, and particularly in the African context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I now have the pleasure of inviting the next speaker, Professor Maxi Schoeman. You have the floor.
Thank you, Cyril. My luck to draw you as the chairperson. I know him as a, so you don't want him as chair. Thank you very much, Godwin, for the invitation to participate in this project, and to everyone here at the ALC, Jacob, you and your colleagues, for all the hard work. Really appreciate it. This is very much a work in progress. It's a paper that has been very problematic for me to write, in the context of the terms of reference that we received, because what I'm trying to do is to explore a country's track record in peace building on the continent. And that country happens to be South Africa, because that is where my area of specialization lies, is in South Africa's foreign policy, and it's specifically its African policy, which is very much built on this idea of the African agenda and promoting peace, security and development on the continent. But it's not that easy to do such a paper. So I will stop once or twice and say these are the areas where I really need some input from other people. I think what is especially important for us as South Africans is the fact that there is not much of a debate, at least as an academic debate, amongst us around how South Africa is perceived on the continent. That makes it problematic. I can give you my impressions, but I think it's very important also to hear what others have to say. So what I'm going to do is, in my first section, just to give a very brief overview of South Africa's foreign policy goals and objectives, situating it specifically within its African agenda. In other words, its foreign policy as far as the African continent is concerned. In the second section, I want to focus on the involvement in peacemaking and peace building, including post-conflict development in the continent. And in the third section, I want to touch on a number of what I consider to be challenges to this role that the country is attempting to play. Now, already in the early 1990s, a period of profound change, not only internationally, but very specifically for us in South Africa, with the end of apartheid, and keeping in mind, I think, then, before 1994, for the ANC, as it was thinking about its engagement with the continent, was also to keep in mind the very destructive consequences of the apartheid policy on South Africa's neighbors. And I think this profoundly influenced the way in which the ANC conceived of its later foreign policy. Already in 1993, President Mandela referred to South Africa's African destiny in an article that was published in Foreign Affairs. And he posited as a core principle upon which post-apartheid South Africa's foreign policy would be built, that of, and I quote, the concerns and interests of the continent of Africa. And in the 2 decades that followed that article and Mandela's claim to an African destiny, what we see is an elaboration and an expansion and a putting into practice of this idea of an African destiny. And we see it with South Africa increasingly claiming and also playing, as far as it is concerned, a leadership role in Africa. And I'm sure you will already see where I need some input. Is this how you see it? We need to talk about that. I think you are all aware of the fact that initially in the mid-1990s, South Africa's involvement on the continent, especially as far as peace building or peacemaking was concerned, was largely confined to mediation efforts, and that idea of exporting, as many people said, the South African model of, how we conceived of our transition. But there were 2 events in particular that made South Africa think differently about this and made its involvement much more practical, much broader, but also much deeper. I think the first was, some of you may remember, the visit of, was it Warren Christopher? He was the American Deputy Secretary of State, I think, who was trying to sell the idea of the African Crisis Response Force to African governments. Now this, I think, had a very big impact on President Mandela, that realization that if we do not do more, the Americans or outsiders would come in and claim this space and bring in their ideas of how we were to rescue the continent. And the second one was, of course, the unfolding of the conflict in the Great Lakes region, again, where South Africa realized that it would have to develop its own peacekeeping capacity that it would not be possible to confine its involvement only to mediation efforts on the continent. So what we see is then progressively this evolving involvement on the continent and getting involved in very specific areas over and above just mediation. I think that one of the clearest expressions of South Africa's increasing commitment to what it refers to as its African agenda came in 2009 when the Department of Foreign Affairs was renamed as the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO. This was a very important, not only a symbolic statement, but it really gave expression to this idea that we were first and foremost committed in our foreign policy to the African agenda. South Africa, during the past or over the past 2 decades, claimed for itself certain roles on the continent. It sees itself, I think, in 3 main ways. The first one is that of a regional leader. And it's quite explicit about this. I'll give you a quote in a minute. And the other 2 roles in support of this role as regional leader are those of the mediator integrator and that of a bridge or a bridge builder. Our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, for instance, in a budget vote in Parliament about 2 or 3 years ago, said the following, and I want to quote her here, and that is, "We have defined ourselves as a progressive agent for positive change. In practice, we have assumed the role of peacemaker and negotiator in Africa and a champion of Africa's interests abroad." So these roles, that of bridge, of a mediator and of a leader on the continent, involves or entail a broad range of actions and activities ranging from attempts to spearhead the restructuring of the Security Council and reorienting the relationship between the Council and the African Union to on-the-ground involvement in peace operations and development activities. If we look at these activities very specifically, I would say that 2 approaches are evident. The first approach of South Africa is its endeavors at institution building, which is perhaps one of the main features of its foreign policy on the continent, very much based on its commitment to rules-based multilateralism. So a very clear commitment to participation in the UN, the AU, and SADC peace missions, but also in institution building. The second approach, I think, is to be found in its bilateral relations with African countries, specifically those immersed in or emerging from conflict. In other words, characterized by development assistance as a form of reconstruction and development. Of course, this kind of policy, this kind of involvement places huge financial burdens on the country. And it's interesting to note that if one makes the sums around South Africa's contribution, it seems as if it is in excess of the UN's prescribed target of 0.7% of GDP per year. And this includes, of course, its fairly big contribution, together with a few other African countries, to the African Union's budget. At the level of continental and regional institutions, South Africa has focused mainly on providing material support to these institutions, supporting the development of the African Union security architecture. And also, I think what was instrumental in terms of South Africa's role was its contribution through President Mbeki, who was, as I say, instrumental in the adoption of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance in early 2007. I think that was also one of the high points of South Africa's contribution to institution building on the continent. If we look at on-the-ground involvement in peace missions and post-conflict development, I think the country also has a rather impressive track record, apart from being the 10th biggest contributor to the UN peace missions and deployments in AU peace missions. Its involvement spans at least 18 countries on the continent: Burundi, Central African Republic, and of course some of these are more successful than others. But I'm just giving you the list here. Comor, DRC, then Ethiopia, Eritrea, Guinea-Bissau, Cote d'Ivoire, Lesotho, Liberia, Madagascar, Mali, Rwanda, Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. And this involvement cuts across the broad spectrum of peace missions, from mediation to post-conflict reconstruction. But much of the peace-building efforts occur on a bilateral level. In a 2013 study titled Enhancing South Africa's Post-Conflict Development and Peace-Building Activity in Africa, undertaken by my colleague Dylan Hendrickson, who is here, and one of her colleagues, Amanda Lucy, they reviewed the scope and impact of South Africa's involvement in Burundi, the DRC, and South Sudan, providing a fairly comprehensive overview of what exactly it is that South Africa is doing in these bilateral engagements with some of these countries, like DRC still in conflict, South Sudan always on the verge of going into conflict again, and Burundi, I know at the moment, fairly uncertain what will happen there, but overall a fairly successful track record so far. Now, I cannot go into the details of what it is that what South Africa is doing, but Godwin asked me to try and look more specifically at South Africa's SSR engagements. And Godwin, I came to the conclusion that that would be fairly difficult. First of all, it would depend on how one defines SSR. And I think from what Dylan has also said, if you want to analyze that, you have to have a very clear indication of what it is that you mean. And what strikes me about South Africa's involvement is that it is actually much broader than SSR. It does not focus specifically on it. From Cheryl's list, would say, especially in South Sudan and DRC, there are elements of SSR, but South Africa seems to be focused very much on governance issues. In other words, the broader idea of building state capacity, which I find interesting in the context of what we're talking about here, is that core assumption that in the end, the responsibility for providing security lies with the state. That is what seems to inform South Africa's involvement. So you have to support the state, or you have to build the state, because the state is responsible for security. But it also leads us to another, I think, very important and interesting question, and that is the one of how easy is it in any case for a state to become involved in non-state activities in another state. In other words, in terms of how you do your peace building, your approach to peace building, given our sensitivities around things like sovereignty, for instance, how easy is it for us to look at the needs of society, or to say, we're going to support the NGO sector? We know how much resentment there often is on the continent because of donors who focus on non-state actors, and there is this question about what exactly is the underlying agenda. So in that sense, South Africa provides, I think, an interesting case study for us. But when you're trying to do good, how do you do good in such a way that you do not offend, but that you actually do them? Oh dear, Cyril, okay, 5 minutes, right. Let me just give you a few of the challenges that I see, that I think that are facing South Africa. And these challenges, I think, face all countries that become involved in peace building. I'm using, as I've said, South Africa specifically as an example. I would say one of the first challenges is in the sphere of ideas, not ideology, but ideas. We're all, I think by now, we've all converted to the idea of human security. Who is at the center of security? It should be people. We talk about people-centered security. What we are still battling to answer is who exactly is responsible to provide that security. So if a state becomes involved in peace building in other conflict societies, what is its role? Where does the responsibility lie for this? And I think that that's something that South Africa is really still battling with, and most other countries as well. A second challenge that South Africa is facing is that whole question around national interest versus universalist interests. Who are you really serving? And this is a big debate in South Africa, and I wish there were time, but not with Cyril as my chair, to give you some practical examples of this. But it's a very big debate. Cheryl and Mr. Deezer will know that with the National Development Plan, for instance, the big debate around the Chapter 7 that deals with our foreign policy. What are we supposed to achieve? Is it first and foremost for our own benefit, in other words, the national interest? Or do we believe in the longer term that by building peace in the continent at this point will in the longer term deliver on national interest? It sounds very abstract, but it's a very real challenge. And I think not only for South Africa, but for several other countries as well. So how do you distinguish when you do good between doing good unto yourself and doing good unto others? And how do you combine the two and ensure that you serve both of them? Because thirdly, South Africa has its own challenges. I am hugely relieved that we're moving slightly away from this idea of youth as being a problem, in other words, the youth bulge, etc., and that we're looking at it more as what it is, and that is a huge problem of unemployment. It's as big a problem in South Africa as it is in any other African country. And this poses a very specific challenge for the country. How much can you afford to do good if you have these huge demands and requirements inside your own country? And we see it, for instance, someone mentioned yesterday, the under-resourced SANDF, how difficult it is, a huge burden on the SANDF when it comes to peace building on the continent, but a defense force which is continuously under-resourced in many ways and not only financially. And lastly, and that is for me always the million-dollar question, how is South Africa's claim to its African agenda and its commitment to the continent, how is that received by the rest of the continent? Is it validated? Is it recognized? Is it celebrated? Is it accepted? We very often see these debates about whether South Africa really has an African identity. It's a very difficult question, but I think it also plays in the way in which we engage on the continent in our ideals to promote peace, security, and development. So, thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Maxi. You know that I was democratically elected for this role, and I have to listen to the voice of the people. So in this regard, I call on the third speaker, Professor Shadrack Nasong'o, to give us his paper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now, the issues I deal with in my paper have already been touched on by a number of speakers, including Dr. Dedeji in his lecture yesterday, including Dr. Godwin, Dr. Fumi, Professor Amina. They have spoken about these issues. So let me summarize my paper in this way. The argument I make in my paper is that society in East Africa has undergone transformations at multiple levels: demographic, economic, social, political, and so on. On the other hand, thinking and practice of national security has remained the same. As I think Dr. Adedeji mentioned yesterday, security institutions in most of the African countries, and particularly East Africa for my case, have been constructed to serve the interests of the political class. the leaders, the protection of the political class, rather than the protection of society. And in this way, therefore, the relationships between the national security institutions and society in general have remained very coercive. And therefore, my argument here is that there is need to rethink national security conceptualization, to rethink national security practice, not just because it has not been touched on through the processes of democratization, liberalization, and so on, as many speakers have mentioned, but particularly because of the imperatives of the moment with regard to these societal transformations. And let me focus on just two of them. The first one has to do with demographic transformation and economic issues. And here, perhaps, let me use the case of Kenya to illustrate the point. Between 1985 and 2010, Kenya's population doubled to 40 million people. And projections, statistical projections indicate that the population will continue to grow at the rate of 1 million every year. That is 3,000 individuals are added on the population every day. And that this will continue up to 2050, when the population of Kenya will actually reach 85 million. Now, what is interesting is that family size has reduced over the years from about 8.1 children per family in 1978 to about 4.6 by 2010. And it is projected that family size will continue to decrease to about 2.6 children by the year 2050. Yet the population increases. Why? Because of two factors. The first factor is that the fertility rates in the previous decades have generated the population growth, so that today we have more families, although with less children, but the growth of children continues to increase because of the fertility rates of the previous decades. Second, the second thing has to do with life expectancy, which has improved dramatically, and it is projected that it will continue to improve, such that by 2050, the life expectancy will improve from 56 to about 64 in the case of Kenya. Now, what are the security implications of this demographic transformation? I should mention that the age group that is said to be increasing dramatically in the case of Kenya is the age group between 15 and 50 years, which is the working population. Now, the problem is that this growth is not merged with economic growth to absorb the working, this growth in the population sense, such that many of the speakers previous have spoken about the youth bulge. What happens if they are not absorbed? I don't know if we have any natural scientists in the room. What happens with a loose molecule? Instability. So if we have this growth in population with no chances of making a living, it is a recipe for instability. And in my experience so far, I have not seen a situation in which the policymakers, especially with regard to national security policy, that they take into account these issues in their device, in the manner in which they design national security strategies. And so we have a potential source of instability with regard to this kind of demographic transformations. And to the extent that, in fact, the recruitment of people who participate in acts of terrorism, the target groups are these individuals who have nothing to lose. They are the ones who are likely to be recruited into these kinds of things. Number two, or the second societal transformation is socio-political transformation. And here I focus on two aspects. We have at the positive level, and we have at the negative level in terms of socio-political transformation in East Africa. At the positive level, we have a critical mass now of well-educated individuals with a heightened sense of understanding of their basic human rights. As a result of more opportunities to go to school, many universities, as we were discussing by the Honorable Member of Parliament, about how many tertiary level institutions have been transformed into universities, so that they're churning out many educated individuals who are not, in fact, gainfully engaged in economic productivity. So, second, we have the democratization wave and its impact, with a more informed, a more critical citizenry ready and willing to take the state to task. We have the increased role of civil society organizations in the political life of the region. The implication here is that the state then has to perform and be seen to perform. It has to deliver. Otherwise, it is now much more easy to mobilize the citizenry against the state than previously because of the heightened sense of understanding, the heightened sense of empowerment, and so on. But this is positive. On the negative side, in terms of socio-political transformation, we have the case of state collapse, especially in Somalia. And if we talk about terrorism in East Africa, this is the source of the terrorism that is going on in this region. Now, the state collapse in Somalia, of course, many scholars have argued, has been a result of the security dilemma following the end of the Cold War, the ouster of Siad Barre in Somalia, and the emergence of so-called warlords in the region. It is the major source of, major challenge to security in the East African region, especially, for example, two trajectories. One has to do with the piracy that emerged in the region, which had international dimensions, and the international forces mobilized at least to defeat the pirates. What activities were they engaging in, these pirates? In 2007, there were 53 attacks in the Suez Canal. The busiest, it is said to be the busiest shipping lane in the world. In 2008, you had 111 attacks, 43 of them successful, hijackings, $30 million paid in ransom. 2009, 156 attacks, 33 successful hijackings, 58 million, in ransom. 2010, 35 successful attacks, successful hijackings, 258 million in ransom. Now, this case of piracy has a lot to do with the transformational sense of Somalia in terms of state collapse, as well as other major dynamics. Number one, illegal fishing by European and Asian trawlers is said to have exhausted fishing stock for Somali fishermen. And so instead of catching fish, they began now catching ships in order to make a living. Second was dumping of toxic waste in Somali waters, which also killed fish stock to the detriment of Somali fishermen. Third, you have no national guard, or Somali state collapse, no national guard to patrol the waters of Somalia. And so the pirates emerged as a nationalistic force. And one of them, in fact, called itself the National Volunteer Coast Guard, which was a pirate network. And all of this emerging out of state collapse in the case of Somalia. Now, look at the people engaged, or who are engaged in this kind of activity. You had local Somali fishermen who had run out of fish stock and now engaged in this. They were the brains behind piracy on account of their skill and knowledge about the sea. The second group were the ex-militiamen, ex-government soldiers. Now, there is no state, you are no longer a soldier, you cannot make a living. These were the muscles, for the pirates. Then the third are technical experts engaged in the same activity, operating equipment such as GPS devices, locating ships in the high seas, and so on. Now, of course, this has had major negative implications, major negative impact on commercial shipping, on global trade, with estimates that $7 to $12 billion were lost during the height of this piracy and so on. Threats to humanitarian aid deliveries, financing of regional conflicts and terrorism, or impact on fishing and tourism in the Seychelles, impact on trade in Kenya and Yemen, and fueling of anarchy in Somalia, fueling of white-collar crime in Kenya through money laundering. Yet, in spite of the negative consequences, there have also been positive consequences as a result of these piracy activities. The positive impact of piracy is rejuvenated onshore spending, with little hamlets transformed into boom towns in the case of Somalia. Foreign trawlers eliminated, and therefore restocking of fish taking place. Toxic waste dumping in Somalia waters curtailed. Now, but the problem here is the rise of Al-Shabaab, leave alone the pirates, because international forces mobilized and defeated the pirates. But the rise of Al-Shabaab out of the Islamic Courts Union and their defeat by Ethiopia with the support of Somalia and so on has become the major security challenge in the case of East Africa, including, of course, many other factors have contributed to this rise of Al-Shabaab. The problem here, on the part of national security, because of the manner in which the national security is conceptualized, the manner in which it is practiced, is that it has been state-centric, so much so that the response to this terrorism is almost always a military approach, rather than engaging with society to utilize their knowledge of these things for purposes of defeating the terrorist networks, the terrorist organizations, and so on. So much so that national security then is conceptualized in a very narrow sense. And the argument I make here is that there is imperative need on the part of policymakers, on the part of national security practitioners, on the part of us scholars, to rethink national security beyond these state-centric conceptualizations that continue to inform national security thinking, national security practice in the East African region. It should not be just about the protection of the political class, physical and political security of the ruling elite against society. These demographic, economic, social, political transformations in the region have serious implications for national security, broadly defined, and they need to be taken into account in national security thinking and practice. But most importantly, in my view, there is need to make the state work for everyone in terms of provision of opportunities to make a decent living on the part of populations that are emerging into the labor market. There is need for equity in the distribution of national resources so that everyone should feel included in the political process. Otherwise, those who feel marginalized, those who feel peripheralized, those who feel oppressed by the state are likely to continue to be the source of insecurity in this part of the continent for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 25 minutes, and I have I have waiting in the wings Wale Ismail. I think I should give you, how much time do you need? 5. Fantastic. He says he can finish in 5 minutes. I'll hold you to it. You have the floor.
Thank you to the presenters for putting quite a lot of interesting but quite cross-cutting issues on the table. Obviously, I wouldn't go into the individual papers. I would just try to pick out cross-cutting themes and issues. I will start with not what has been presented today, but what was presented yesterday. which was Dr. Adedeji Febo's presentation, especially in the context of the UN Resolution UNSC 2151 on SSR. And now it's actually in the context of Dylan's presentation in terms of what has changed. Obviously, I think Dylan was more or less referring to the traditional donors in light of this. But it would be good to be able to see if there has been any similar evolution or change in terms of intra-African perspective as well as SSR-related assistance to fellow African countries. So that is issue number one. Issue number two is something that has come up quite heavily yesterday and today, which is the regional element, the regional dimensions of security, but quite interestingly, SSR as well. And I think Eka alluded to some of this in the context of developmental post-conflict construction state in Africa. And I think the three presenters today alluded to regional issues or regional element or regional context of SSR issues, be it in the context of South Africa and its going back and forth in terms of what its role is in Africa and how it sees itself versus how it is seen. Similarly, in terms of Somalia and what the implications, the regional and even trans-regional implications of the insecurity emanating from that. As a result of this, I think it will be quite interesting for the three speakers to reflect on the regional dimensions of the security issues at play, but more importantly, the security response or responses to those security challenges from a regional point of view and what this will mean for SSR. By that, I will actually even want to put it on the plate that what is the level of interoperability between national level thinking and practices of SSR versus potential regional or cross-national level thinking and practices of SSR. I know, the two people sitting here are perhaps the most competent people in Africa to respond to that because they have been part of, people who crafted regional level SSR template. But I think it will be good to hear first from the presenters. I'm sure they will have something to say about it. The final issue that I also feel came quite cross-cutting, or which, even if it wasn't really explicit but quite implicit in the three presentations, was the transformational element of SSR. I get a feeling people are speaking to SSR in terms of the technical element, in terms of provision of training, provision of technical assistance, and the rest. But the transformational, element of it, and I think Dylan ended his presentation on that note when he said, is it the case that SSR has actually lost its significance in developing countries or not, the substance of it, that it is being reduced to technical issues. So it will be quite interesting to hear from the three presenters in terms of what has happened to the transformational element, the transformational idea, the notion of SSR as a change rather than a set of technical or administrative steps or issues or interventions. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wally, for keeping to your 5 minutes. Now we have time for some questions, and I will give the last 6 minutes to the presenters to respond. So please indicate by show of hands if you have any questions or comments. Yes, please.
Yeah, I actually...
You can come up here. Okay.
Very brief. First of all, let me thank the presenters. These were very, very rich papers and very insightful. I'll keep this brief, but I just want to echo something that Dylan said about the fact that SSR really seems to have indeed lost its substance. It has become a little bit of a slogan. And the best illustration of that I saw recently, certainly, was in the CAR, where just about everybody and their brother are SSR experts. An illustration of the fact that, again, it did lose its substance for a number of reasons, one of which certainly is one of the reasons that Dylan highlighted as far as the lack of capacity of some of the donor agencies that have to play a role without really knowing their partition in it. Let me ask Dylan the following question. When he talks about donors, clearly this is a varied category. Can you maybe unpack this for us and in particular tell us what is the role that has been taken on or taken up by the Scandinavian countries? Recently they've become quite active. Can you explain why that's the case and what is behind the fact that countries that have never been in this area have started suddenly to expend millions of dollars on SSR? And maybe related to that, why is it that given the admittedly low level of capacity of donor agencies in the north, why wasn't there an investment in the south, in Africa in particular, in institutions such as the SSN, for example, to help kind of fill the gap in knowledge and capacity that these donors don't have? As far as Maxi's presentation, quickly, what I can tell you about South Africa's perception in certainly Francophone Africa, and in particular Cote d'Ivoire, was I think driven mainly by the role that Mbeki played in the crisis in Cote d'Ivoire. And that perception was the perception of a country that doesn't seem to know very well some of the countries in which it intervenes, certainly in the Francophone world, going way out of its depth. And well, let me just keep it at that for now. We can have an apartheid on this. Maybe I can give you some additional cues. Finally, for the last presenter, reading the paper yesterday, I saw that Uhuru seems to be having some problems with overhauling his security team. I wonder if you can say a word about that. And did the Eastern African community make any effort at all in trying to craft a regional agenda for security? Clearly, security is not just Kenyans or Somalis. It has become regional. Did they start at least the thinking in terms of crafting a regionally based strategy? Thank you. Sorry to take a bit longer.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to bring the issue of the state and regionalism, and that question has been asked in context of the terrorism agenda. First, I want to respond to my brother. We have a peace and security protocol, and it is aimed at mainstreaming issues of security threat to the region. Now, the state in regionalism and the kind of state that is envisaged is not that state that puts too much emphasis on sovereignty, because essentially when you choose to integrate, what you are doing is ceding part of your sovereignty to a supranational level of authority in order to be able to achieve a common good. So when you if you want to maintain 100% sovereignty, then joining an integration arrangement may not be the best way to go. So you find that in some cases, countries still want to behave. It's like a marriage. Once you're married, there are certain degree of aspects of your life that need to be appreciated in a give and take. So in that aspect, that ability to accept certain things or certain processes to be undertaken at a regional level for purposes of being able to achieve a common good become important. And the issue of terrorism, because now the East African community is under a threat of terrorism. It's not just Kenya. It could be temporary that they've not had strikes in different partner states, but generally the region is under threat. And a collective engagement in this area is something that is most desirable. But you find that at the region, for instance, the Peace and Security Protocol was signed, but only 2 partner states have ratified it. And yet, for it to take full effect, all of them must ratify it. So there are those dynamics where we fall back into our own enclave and we miss the big picture.
Well, thank you. Before I continue, I want to seek the mandate of the audience to extend the closing time by 10 minutes. Because looking at the way the contributions are coming and the contributions are so rich, it's only fair that we allow the chairman to extend. on this call, I would ask Dr. Ebo to please ask his question.
I'm not sure I have many questions, Mr. Chair, but I have a few comments. And I think, I don't know if you're Dylan or somebody who raised the issue about whether we are at a dead end. Whether we are at a dead end in terms of this paradigm. Maybe Bubakar.
That was you that raised it yesterday.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, that's something that keeps me awake at night. And I've said this in other situations that I think the current SSR paradigm is to an extent flogging a dead horse. It's been on since, as Dylan reminded us, Clay Short came up with this security sector reform concept. And the reason why we are flogging a dead horse is that I think the donors have pushed this as far as they can. And they are not stupid. They know that it's not working, in my view. But their interest and the realities of the game will not allow them to go further. And I'll tell you what I mean. For example, you find that increasingly, because of the sensitivities of the operationalization of SSR, donors are increasingly, in many cases, outsourcing. Because it allows them a lot of distance from the sensitivities, from the blowback. For example, in the case of Liberia, that I think Dylan referred to, certainly in many other contexts. The implications of that for governance we can leave aside. The other development that I think keeps us at the dead end is that the traditional donors are becoming increasingly irrelevant to the emerging realities of Africa. Where is China on security sector reform? You know, because this is probably the most active country on the continent. And so those who are busy on SSR are not necessarily those who are building the roads or bringing the guns or engaging the military in a operational sense. So they are stuck at the level of theories, and other countries are doing the practice. So that's another reason why I think we have been flogging a dead horse. The other reason why this is the case is that the traditional donor approach in terms of reporting has to be quantitative. Something you can take a picture of and send report back to HQ. As we've been saying since yesterday, what you need to do in Africa is the more qualitative changes, the mindset changes. You can't take pictures of those things. So again, they become increasingly irrelevant. The other reason why I think we are flogging a dead horse, Dylan said security sector reform, that counterterrorism has been putting SSI under pressure. It is true, but the opposite is also true. SSR is putting counterterrorism under pressure.
How?
I will explain. You ask yourself, why is it that the Americans are involved in training and equipping Afghanistan? They spend so much money training the soldiers and the policemen, and the same guys they are training and equipping take the same guns they are giving them and shoot them with the guns. Because all they are doing is training and equipping. They are not going to the level of social contract development, engaging these people, either because it takes too much time or they don't know how. So the need for SSR is putting counterterrorism under pressure and showing its limitations, So that's another reason why I think increasingly we just keep singing the song of SSR is about effectiveness and accountability, but beyond that we can't go further, because once you go beyond the policy talk, the reality is a bit convoluted. One or two things to add, if you allow me, Mr. Chair.
Can you make it one?
Okay, just one. In which case I'll make a choice. It's about, I plead with you too. The role of South Africa. The role of South Africa. The role of South Africa is key. It's been key to the evolution of this concept in the UN, at least. I could tell you a long story, but I won't. But we can talk together with you later. It's a key role, not only in the UN, but also the development of the AU's SSR policy, which was actually put on the table in Cape Town. I think some of you were there, by the then South African Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is today the chairperson of the AU. So I think that is key. The last thing I would say is the emerging reality of follow the money. Donors are increasingly paying more attention, including the World Bank, that's now becoming increasingly interested, on public expenditure review and public financial management. I think that's another thing that we also need to put into the mix when we are talking about the increasing, the new things about the subject area, but there isn't enough time.
Well, from the way you talk, I think first I have to thank you, but it seems that certain parts of the horse are still alive. I don't know what part.
No, I disagree, Cyril. I think we've really reached a cul-de-sac in our security thinking, which is partly why we're having this conference, and with SSR, Dylan. I think tomorrow I'll raise the point, which is very similar to yours. It's not that I look at human security, that there's something wrong with the way in which we've conceptualized human security or SSR, but that the institutions were supposed to be implementing this are the very same traditional security institutions. We haven't gone much further than to say, don't be state-centric, be people-centered, etc. And then left it up to the police, the border guards, etc., to go and implement this. And then we're surprised that we're still sitting here today saying the same things. Maxi, thank you for an insightful paper. I think you've hit the nail on the head with what is the role of the South African state? That is the question that I think we as South Africans have to ask, but also put it out there to the broader community. I'm intrigued by this role of South Africa's bridge builder. Building bridges between whom and whom? Because in its own mind, it's building bridges between donors and other African countries, right? And it's also part of this whole gateway to Africa conceptualization. But why does it think it can play that role? What does it have? Is it because of its economy? Is it because we have some greater understanding about post-conflict situations in Africa? Is it because of this own schizophrenic identity of ours, of having both the West and Africa in one country? What is it that we as South Africans think gives us this ability to play this role between donors and other post-conflict countries? I was quite surprised when we did this research last year at the haphazard nature of South Africa's engagement in Africa. You know, just touching here, touching there, and then going on, and then wondering why there's no impact, and wondering why other people are so disappointed at its engagement. There is no broader or deeper vision that South Africa has for the rest of the continent, except to say that it has to say it, or it has to lead the agenda. We really haven't thought through how we are going to do things differently as South Africans, and I think that is the question that we need to be thinking through too.
Thank you very much. We'll be talking about the horse later. Now I would call upon Fumi.
There is God. I thought you No, very quickly. I mean, I was planning to shut up in this session, but I think I've been provoked a little bit. But just to make a couple of quick points. You know, I think indeed we're flogging a dead horse, if I may say so, unless we change direction very quickly. And one of the main reasons why we're flogging a dead horse is that Africa's own contribution to SSR, which actually is South African scholars were very, very key in this, was the notion of transformation. That in order for us to do any meaningful reform, we need to transform the intentions that underpin, the creation, the work of the security sector. And that actually means a great deal rewriting the social contract, because there was really none. I mean, it's part of the conversation that we were having this morning. And we failed to do that, and others hijacked the thing. So Dylan's point about this evolution of this thing on the donor side and donor interest, is key to this, which actually can only go so far. And I think his point there, some of his points are well taken. Now, the concept of donorship also has changed, and I think if you look at the new Security Council resolution to which Wale Ismail was alluding to, I suspect has also changed because of the roles that countries like South Africa play in Africa. And South Africa's contribution to scholarship in this area is one, contribution to policy precisely because of Cape Town meeting and the way in which South Africa and the Security Council engage this. And I think that Security Council role is crucial to South Africa's contribution. I want to agree with Cheryl that when it comes to try to practicalizing that, because it's in so many, it works in so many directions, it cannot really see a place to add value. And yet it has the potential to add value. But certainly what we know is that Africa too is coming of age, because a country like South Africa is playing a role, whether as gatekeeper or bridge builder, whatever it is a potential actor in that place, and it needs to get its act right. But if I turn quickly to Nasong'o's point, which, presentation, which I think actually helps us to connect the narrative in very interesting ways. He has put particular challenges on the table. This is a situation where the narrative between society and those that are security building, especially the externals, there's complete divergence. Somalia is the place that represents that the most. Because in Somali society, where the clan system is what everybody has been talking about, what dominates everything, the first actor in the last decade that has transcended clan is Al-Shabaab. It governed, whether we like it or not, and it actually collected taxes and governed its environment. We also know that Boko Haram started by feeding people and farming and things like that, precisely because the state is absent in those places. But externals came and turned that narrative into these are terrorists for all sorts of other agendas. And they have created a problem for us in the region, which we ourselves are still taking state-centric approaches to try to resolve. And the real question which Kenya and the region will have to ask, especially if there's going to be a new regional approach, which Nigeria is refusing to ask, is actually, can we be turning our attention, because you are asking, how do state actors do non-state things? The real issue is, can we go back to the drawing board and negotiate with so-called terrorists in our region? Might it be a faster route to trying to have a collective conversation around security? Are we going to go the American way and say these are terrorists in our backyard, and until we kill them all, and kill all Somalis in Kenya, and kill all Muslims in northern Nigeria, we won't have peace? And actually that peace will elude us permanently. And this actually, I think, is the canker on the table around security conversations. Thank you. Thank you. When is it that they negotiate?
Thank you very much. I hope you are the last. I think so.
With your permission.
Sorry, while that conversation about terrorism was going up, I looked up an old favorite. And as someone who supported, like many of us here, national liberation struggles, the word we used to use was guerrilla warfare. Here's the definition. Type of warfare fought by irregulars in fast-moving, small-scale actions against orthodox military and police forces and, on occasion, against rival insurgent forces, either independently or in conjunction with a larger political strategy. Definition of guerrilla warfare. You all remember our late friend Che Guevara. So what I'm saying is Africa does have a proclivity for so-called terrorism because in our history we used it to liberate ourselves from the forces of occupation. So I just want to put that there. Then secondly, I want to suggest that certainly from any kind of feminist perspective, security sector reform was moribund from the beginning. And the efforts to genderize it, no less than 7 UN security resolutions are the same, they're declarations. We're not seeing women being seriously involved as equals in the security conversation, despite all those 7 resolutions, 13, 25, 2000. I can list them. You can go to the webpage and see them. They've done 2 things. One, try to inclusionary strategy, integrate women into the existing structures, which are so deeply misogynistic and patriarchal that that has to be seen as a joke, unless you're willing to transform those structures. The second angle that is pursued is by isolating sexual and gender-based violence from the ongoing carnage. Okay, there's a sex-gender expression of violence that women are peculiarly, not even peculiarly, but mainly, more women than men are subjected to. But if you look at the levels of torture and violence, men are sexually violated as well, when body parts are cut off. The violations of the body are across all our countries. I don't think we should separate it out and have special resolutions. And in any case, they're not going to be effective. So I would like us to accept the death of security sector reforms because it basically is re-empowering the old boys, recirculating power in those same structures which are part of insecurity and being part of the problem. I don't know why we're doing it. I think Dylan gave us maybe a possible answer in his first presentation. I got the impression from your remarks, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're trying to overload a misconceived concept with transformative agendas. But it's not called security sector transformation. It's reform. Reform. That's not a transformative paradigm. We had reform in higher education. It was about, what did that mean? And now with the privatization of security sector reform, you have corporations like DynCorp rebuilding, retraining the Liberian army. The US government has outsourced it to corporations for profit. So why are we talking about it? I mean, it's interesting. I'm not knocking the conversation. I just want to push it a bit more.
Thank you very much. Colleagues,
No, you should be promoted beyond this level.
Yes. I solemnly declare that the horse is dead. However, what do we do? And I think that this is where the rethinking would emerge from. Now that the horse is dead, how do we move from here? Do we need another animal? Or do we need a mechanized contraption? Or do we go back to the mindset? Or do we go back to the people? Those conversations. This morning we had so much about conversations. I think that in rethinking the dead horse, we probably need to start a new conversation. And I'm happy that I was elected to this role because I believe that the ALC is going to play a catalytic role in this new conversation. But because time is not with us, I will not bore you any further. I will invite the three presenters in reverse order to respond to the comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Quick responses. First, for Wali, I think your issue was addressed by the Honorable MP that we have a peace and security protocol which has not yet been operationalized because of lack of ratification. And therefore, generally then, the regional engagement on the part of governments in Eastern Africa have been largely on the basis of national self-interest. The ICU, the Islamic Courts Union, emerged in Somalia. Ethiopia sees it as a threat. They invade. They defeat the ICU. Unfortunately, it gives way to the rise of Al-Shabaab. Kenya sees Al-Shabaab as a major threat. They invade. It's only after they take the initiative that the African Union comes in to give an umbrella to that. For Professor Ndiaye, Uhuru has a problem overhauling Kenyan security system. No, actually it is the political opposition that is demanding the overhauling of the security system because of the perception, I think, that it is dominated by members from one region and that there is need to diversify the security sector. And in my view, I think it is this tendency to people the security then system with people from particular regions that informs the thinking of national security as supposed to serve the interests of the particular person who has appointed these individuals. And therefore, the idea that it's disengaged from society. So we are serving the president, and that is it. We are harassing the opposition. We protect the president, and anything else is out of the question. Dr. Fumi, I agree with you about the fact that especially the Islamic Courts Union, very effective in ruling, of course, Somalia at that point in time, but by 2006, Ethiopia moves in and defeats them. Al-Shabaab emerges, of course, Islamic as it was, using Islamic Sharia to rule the region under its control, very effectively, you would argue. But of course, then the narrative is that then they are terrorists, they are Islamists. And the reason why actually Ethiopia also invaded to rout the ICU was the idea that an Islamic government is not, what is the concept to use? Is not agreeable or something like that. Yeah, it's not acceptable. Professor Mama, I agree with you. One person's terrorist is, of course, another person's liberation fighter or freedom fighter. For a long time, Yasser Arafat was designated as a terrorist. But by 1994, he would receive the what? The Nobel Peace Prize. Mandela was categorized as a terrorist, but he was a freedom fighter, and he has become a moral icon in the world. There are different forms of terrorism, and so I didn't want to go into that. You have nationalism, what you can call nationalist terrorism. You have what many people call religious terrorism. You have right-wing terrorism. You have left-wing terrorism if you go into the literature and so on and so forth. I think that is all. Thank you.
I'm going to be very brief and not respond to every comment, except to say thank you very much. I think I got some very interesting ideas that I can take further. As I said, I was really worried because this is for me very difficult. When Cheryl asks me, why do we think that, why does South Africa think that it can be a bridge builder? That's part of this problem, is this idea of self-ascribed roles vis-a-vis what you can do and what is acceptable for you to do. And that brings me to what Fumi has said, and that is perhaps the main challenge for South Africa, and I haven't thought about it in that way, is how differently can we think? Because we are now establishing SATPA, the South African Development Partnership Agency. We're seeing ourselves, and there are several other African countries who are also donor countries, but we're very specific about this. The biggest challenge will, of course, be how different will we be from the traditional donors, and I think that is an excellent aim to help one try and answer some of these questions. To what extent, because it's going to be a very difficult thing going into partnership, these trilateral partnerships. I'm not sure that we know exactly what it is that we're getting into. But this kind of paper offers an opportunity to explore some of that, and I will do it. And then one last thing around China and its role. It's true, we don't really pay attention to them. And I believe that they are increasingly looking at the whole issue of security in Africa. They were very hesitant to get involved, but maybe the reason why they're beginning to ask questions is because of FOCAC next year. The summit will be jointly chaired by China and South Africa. And that provides a space perhaps for us to explore China's ideas about security on the continent. We're not looking at it, and it's something that I can perhaps talk to you, Godwin, because we've been asked at the university to do something around it, and I've been trying to find a hook for that. And maybe it would be good for us, because very often, I'm not anti-Chinese, but very often we allow the Chinese to set the agenda, like on FOCAC, etc. And what we fail to do is to set our own agenda and to say, this is what we would like to talk to you about. And the FOCAC summit might give us an opportunity to explore the Chinese perceptions and approaches to security on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I found the comments very stimulating. I'm going to start with the final comments made by Funmi and by Deji, and really asking this question whether we are at the dead end of a paradigm. And actually, the more I thought about this, listening to all the comments, I think we're talking about two different paradigms right here. And I think the biggest problem we faced all of these years is we've conflated donor SSR assistance programs with the programs which African countries should be developing themselves to address their security problems. And I think one of the reasons which SSR as a concept came about was because there did not exist an African concept or an Asian concept or a Latin American concept that was inclusive and integrated. There did exist concepts, but not necessarily one that met the bill as far as donors and African countries themselves were concerned. And so I think what's happened, of course, is that donors have come in to fill the void with their own particular concept. And the donor SSR concept, I think, was very much delivered, first of all, to enable development actors to justify their involvement in working in the security sector, first of all in Sierra Leone. And so there are two big questions they had to answer. One was, what needs to be done in Sierra Leone to address these problems? And the other question was, how can we as a donor best support that process? But in the process, because there was not a paradigm in place on the ground, the two issues became conflated, and I think that's really the source of our problems. And so I think what's quite clear from the conference that we're having here is that there's general agreement that Africa needs to develop its own approach. There needs to be a genuine African dialogue on this. This needs to be something that's African-led. And I think for me, what I was trying to focus on the paper is about what donors need to do to support that kind of process. And that means working in a certain way to support it, but stopping very far short of telling African countries what they need to do, providing appropriate kinds of support, supporting the debates, and facilitating it where possible. So I think that's the first point that I wanted to make. So I don't think the question necessarily, I think we do need to look at this in terms of two different paradigms. Secondly, I think we need to get away from terminology. I mean, I share completely your frustrations. SSR means different things to virtually every single donor. Many donors don't even use the terminology anymore because they have concerns about this. Even DFID now, very few people use SSR. They talk about security and justice assistance. And so a lot of this has to do with concerns because of the way that SSR, the terminology, has become blemished, and largely because they focus very narrowly, for instance, on military actors. So there are lots of problems with the terminology. But all of these different terms at least share a common set of principles, and there are problems with some of these principles, but by and large, the principles themselves are actually quite sound and offer something to build upon. So I think in terms of an alternative, yes, we can change the terminology, but let's focus on the principles, and that's really, I think, what is most important right now. In terms of donors, in my chapter, which I develop eventually, I want to actually distinguish between the approaches of some of the donors, and my initial focus is going to be on the UK, the Netherlands, and the USA as bilaterals, because they offer there's a lot of differences between their approaches. The Dutch are very, very interesting. They're only really engaged in Burundi. They have an 8-year memorandum of understanding with the government. They're very much working in a transformative way. And they have a security sector development program. And they've said we can't accomplish anything in 2 years or 4 years. We need 8 years. Nicole Ball has written a very interesting article, which you can easily Google, on the governance-led approach to SSR being supported by the Dutch in Burundi. And it's very, very interesting. It's a step-by-step approach. It's governance-led. I've recently been involved there with the defense review process, and I've just gone through a lesson learning process with them. And again, some of these same principles apply. But that approach is at the other extreme from the US approach to so-called SSR in Africa, which is really about counterterrorism. So within that umbrella of SSR, we have many, many different approaches. And I think what struck me is when I started to look at donor SSR policies, if you ask the UK government, Mark White, I asked him, what policy what document best represents your approach to SSR? And he said, well, to be honest, it's probably our 2003 SSR policy document. We haven't done anything else since then. And so to understand what donors are doing, it doesn't actually make sense necessarily to look at their policy documents or necessarily what they say, because it's often people saying things who don't know much about SSR. Look at what's happening on the ground. And looking at what's happening on the ground, you see a lot of very, very interesting, innovative things taking place. And some of the people involved in this room are involved in some of these donor-supported activities on the ground. I certainly am. And I think much of what I'm doing now has no bearing with what we were talking about 15 years ago. It is much more process-oriented. It is much more about trying to support a national process as opposed to impose solutions. So that's been a transformation that's taken place in the way that external actors, some of them, not everybody. So I think looking at what's happening on the ground is very, very important. Just very quick responses to some of the other points raised. The intra-African SSR assistance, I think that's very, very relevant. It's not something I'm going to look at closely in my chapter, except insofar as one of the things that donors should be doing, of course, is looking at how they can support that. And one way they are, of course, is, for instance, supporting the SSR development process within the AU, or to a certain extent some of the regional economic communities. SSR's transformation, and yes, I think the Dutch themselves are thinking in those ways, even though they don't necessarily use the language. But I think what's very important to keep in mind is that, relatively speaking, donors are providing peanuts in terms of assistance in this area. And we've generated huge expectations that a small donor SSR program is going to reform, the security sector in Uganda or the DRC. It's all peanuts. And so I think much of what donors are doing is necessarily piecemeal. They can support strategically in a few small areas. And that's all the more reason why these need to be government-led or nationally led processes, and there needs to be a concept in place. And so I think this distinction between what donors do to support a process and what that process actually is very, very important. Boubacar, I don't know what the Scandinavians are doing. So are they spending millions? Okay, so maybe they've started. Okay. Are you advising them on that?
You didn't ask me. I'll try to find out a little more.
Okay. No, I don't know, but yeah, I'll have a look at that. So I think that addresses the main issues.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, it's my pleasure to thank the 3 paper presenters as well as our discussants. as well as this wonderful audience. Thank you very much. I think you all deserve a round of applause. And on that note, I hand the session back to Godwin.
Thank you very much, Cyril. Your unilateral declaration of the horse dead was not consultative enough. So we will revisit that topic. Yeah, but again, Cyril, thank you very much. And the presenters and discussants, thank you very much. I think we started this morning on a very, very good note. And I think we've also concluded on a good note. And basically, I think that the question is still popping out there, that to what extent are the security issues that we are dealing with addressing society-based concerns, society-based developments, and society-based questions that the communities are asking out there. And I think that we are on to something here. So I'm very, very glad that this conversation has begun, and I'm looking forward to its conclusion tomorrow, when we really get to tie up a number of things that we've been talking about. We've basically gone through a process of conceptualization. We've looked at different sectors, the youth. We've looked at the question of security sector reform and all that. And I think that we should be able, by the end of day tomorrow, to begin to find pathways into new research thinking, new knowledge around some of these questions, and to begin to make a contribution conceptually around some of these questions. So I really want to appreciate the contributions from all of you, and to basically thank you again for your time. I believe that some arrangements have been made to pick up all the conference participants who are going in different directions. There will be a bus to take you to where you are, or a van. But I'm going to ask the following: Cyril Obi, Maxi, Kevin, myself, and Toko, Deji, and Cheryl to remain behind as the others go, because we need to have a partnership engagement around some of the things that we hope to be doing with you. So let me wish you a good evening. Nairobi has an interesting evening and nightlife, so don't miss out on that. But please remember to rest, because tomorrow we expect you here at 8:30. I think for those ones of you who are coming from the Heron Hotel, there will be a bus to pick you at 8. And for those ones who are coming from Oak Ridge, there will also be a bus to pick you at 8. So thank you very much, and see you again tomorrow.